he remade the metropolitan area. Earlier, we saw a statistic that New York City was in the top 10 mega cities at the turn of the century and again at the turn of the next century, and was unique in being in both those groups. There's something about the continued success of New York that requires notice, and that is that if what Robert Moses did was so bad for New York, how is it that New York now remains the city in the United States with the most balanced transportation system? That we are the least auto-dependent city in the United States. And yet, almost everything he did in the transportation arena, actually, everything he did in the transportation arena was focused on automobile use and building highways and building parkways and facilitating the use of the automobile to get in and around metropolitan New York. I would argue that for the most part, what Robert Moses did in that regard was enable New York to remain a viable metropolitan area that was linked together in a modern way in a new era. And fortunately, this is a big factor, fortunately, he was stopped before he could do irreparable damage by going too far. What we ended up with is this city that you can get around by multiple modes. And I don't think New York would be nearly as successful in the 21st century if it hadn't actually had an automotive infrastructure to make it through the last half of the 20th century. But fortunately, he didn't go too far in that regard. That's open to debate, and I'm oversimplifying a complex argument there. But more important than that is that the policies he was working with, a set of national policies for transportation, were just as powerful as the housing policies in encouraging people and capital to leave the cities. And what I mean by that, again, it's a complicated story, and in the interest of time, I'll shorten it, is that the federal government collected revenues in cities where all the economic activity was happening, not all the economic activity, but most of the economic activity was happening, because these policies start in a big way in the 1920s, and the 1920 census was the first U.S. census where more than half the population lived in cities. In some ways, the 1920 census is like, for the U.S., is the same point we are at now globally. More than half the population then lived in cities. Just like now we are focusing on more than half the population in the world lives in cities. The cities that we had then in the United States were not functioning adequately. The cities that people were moving to now in the global urbanization and migration are not functioning adequately. We can't take, I don't want to take that analogy too far, but there are lessons to be learned here. So these transportation policies were collecting money in cities and spending that money to build infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, outside the cities. Highway funding rarely was permitted to be spent in cities, or maybe 5% of it could be spent in cities. Even when we get up to the point where they're building urban interstates, that's a very small percentage of the overall project. It could be spent in cities, but that's where the tax revenue was being collected. And these were limits that in the federal legislation that were imposed upon the states. So the states then again were funding their state highway programs, mostly driven by matching the federal program, but sometimes they had enough of their own money in some states to match, to create their own programs. And they too were reproducing this pattern of transferring wealth from settled areas to unsettled areas, collecting money where people live, building infrastructure where people did not live. So this transportation policy was layered on to the housing policy, creating an intentional dispersal of people across the countryside. In particular, when we talk about dispersing people across the countryside, I think it's important to think about not just the travel that people had from where they lived to where they worked, but thinking about what I consider the four functions of people's lives. And again, this affects land use patterns, affects environmental impact, affects sustainability. Those four functions, aside from work and residence, are also consumption and leisure. And increasingly, all four of those functions were dispersed across the countryside, across metropolitan areas that were increasingly large and across the whole country. And that's what we now know of as sprawl. Okay, I will wrap up here by saying two lessons from that, and then a final point. I'm going to be quick with all those. Those two lessons are, one, the causes of sprawl as an unsustainable environmental transformation are not local causes, and therefore the solutions cannot be exclusively local solutions. We have to address these nationwide policy causes if we're going to address the continued decentralization of population and dispersal of land uses on a large scale. We need larger scale solutions across the national scale. That's lesson one. Lesson two has to do with the subsidies that we continue to give to people that use private automobiles. If people that use automobiles are charged less for use of the roads than it costs for those roads to be provided, and I'm combining here license fees, driver's license, the license plates on your car registration fees, tolls, gas taxes, all those together at the peak might have amounted to as much as 45 to 50% of construction costs. Don't come close to covering even 10 or 15% of operating costs, and more typically it's about a third of construction costs. So there's been this constant, enormous subsidy to providing automotive infrastructure. At the same time, we always expect transit to be self-supporting. People say, how long will that new transit line take to pay for itself? They never say that about how long will the highway take to pay for itself. As long as we continue to have, by the government lowering the price to the consumer of automotive transportation, you end up with excess demand. If you think about supply and demand, there's a price at which there will be equilibrium. If the government is artificially lowering the price to the consumer, there will be more demand, and that's what traffic congestion is. More demand than there is supply for highways. As long as we continue to subsidize highways, we will continue to have traffic congestion problems, and we will continue to encourage people to separate those four functions of life. And then the last point is the notion of the crisis, the use of that term crisis.